Jezebel said, "Boo. You tell Elijah, he of the sword, tell him, may the gods run me through just like that. And worse, if I haven't caught him on the tip of my sword by this time tomorrow. Tell him." You needn't tell Elijah twice. He was off like an arrow, running for his life. He saw how it was. He ran for the border. The prophet just yesterday, floating on his triumph over the prophets of Baal, now hightailing it out of town with just one servant in tow, running to avoid the sharp edge of Jezebel's rage. He leaves his servant in Beersheba, lightens his load, heads over the highway's edge and into the wild places. A day's journey in, he finds a craggy tree, silhouette interrupting the flat desert landscape, and collapses under it. It is here under the broom tree that we find out just how defeated Elijah is. "It is enough. Lord, take my life. I'm a failure, like my ancestors." Enough. Done. So done. That's it. I've had it. I'm out. Maybe you have other statements of exasperation for times when you are just so done. When I find myself feeling done in the last few years, it has to do with people espousing one set of values and living out another, especially in their community or public life. What have you had enough of in this season? Think about it for a minute and raise your hand when you can think of your own done. Then we'll all call them out together. All right, raise your hand when you think of your done. Got it? Okay. Call it out on 3. 1, 2, 3. Hypocrisy. But friends, while Elijah may be done, something out there in that wilderness is not ready to be done with Elijah. Not just yet. An angel taps him awake. Being done is exhausting, isn't it? And tells him to eat something. And look, there's the something. A loaf of light bread, still warm from the stone oven, and cool water to drink. Elijah ate and drank and slept again. Again the angel came, another tap to wake Elijah, encouragement to finish the bread and water, to be equal to the journey. The angel's food carried him the whole journey, 40 days and nights, to the Mount of God. And then he stopped. Had Elijah been headed to Mount Horeb all the time? Had the angel been showing him the way? Had he just walked for 40 days and nights and decided that 40 days and nights was its own kind of enough? Elijah stops at the mountain of God, goes into a cave, and spends the night. The word of the Lord finds Elijah there. The word of the Lord finds Elijah there. Friends, think with me about your own personal doneness. We named it before. I wonder whether you and I, when we'd named our doneness, when we'd found the spot of shade in the desert and passed out under it, when we'd eaten and drunk, when we'd slept and eaten again. I wonder, you and I, whether when we'd made our own 40 days journey to what felt like God's mountain, solid and safe, the kind of place we might just hear something that made sense, and slept again in the shelter of the rock, I wonder whether the word of the Lord might just find us. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? The question so ubiquitous it even gets asked at 9 o'clock on a Saturday when the regular crowd shuffles in. They sit at the bar and throw bread in my jar and say, "Man," listen, if you will, to the way the Piano Man's groupies ask the question, "Man, what are you doing here?" Asked this way, the question implies that Piano Man is somehow misplaced there in that bar, behind that piano. But there are other ways to ask the question. Another way would be to emphasize the what. What are you doing here, Elijah? Look at yourself here now. What is it you are doing here really? You've run for your life, your soul, then just as quickly ask for it to be taken from you. You've stopped taking care of yourself and stopped looking for a future. What are you doing here? There's also the question of location. Elijah, what are you doing here? What is this place? You ran for 40 days and 40 nights, and anyone who's been stuck in an ark or waiting to go into labor knows that 40 is code for long enough to be good and done. 40 days and 40 nights just to end up, checks notes, in the mouth of a cave? Seems like you could have found a cave 40 days and nights ago and saved yourself some steps. So this cave is in Horeb, the Mount of God, you say? What's so special about Mount Horeb? Well, it turns out a lot. I don't know about Starkville, but Auburn has a neighboring town right down the road, a sister city, if you will, with all the occasional sibling rivalry that comes with that relationship. One of the things we share with Opelika is roads, but we don't always agree on the names. What we call Opelika Road in Auburn becomes Pepperell Parkway in Opelika, and Glen Avenue turns into Frederick Road in Opelika. Turns out this kind of thing is nothing new. Moses, it turns out, had his own experience with God, what theologians call a theophany, right there on Mount Horeb, but it was called by the more familiar name, Mount Sinai. Moses, like Elijah centuries after, was weary and in need of the reassurance that God's presence was near. Moses begs, "God, show me your glory." And God says, "I hear you. I hear you." But God knew that Moses, in his own 40 is plenty moment, needed to nourish his soul. "Because of my compassion and mercy, Moses, instead of giving you what you ask for, all of my glory, I choose to show you all of my goodness." And there in that moment, God hears what Moses asks for to see God's glory and gives Moses what he needs to see God's goodness. Out of compassion, God settled Moses in the cleft of the rock, sheltered his view from the glory he could not handle, and warmed him in all the goodness he could. Which brings us back to Elijah, centuries later in time, but the same holy mountain to which Elijah has fled, disheartened, fearful, tired, flat, busted. And Elijah has a request of God also. God, if you are listening, hear me now. Take my life. I've had enough. And in a different way, God comes to Elijah, and God hears Elijah asking for death, acknowledges hearing Elijah by saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah pours his heart out. "I have been zealous for the Lord. I have done my best. I have worked as hard as I could, and it's all come to nothing. I can't go on anymore. It is enough. Take my life. Let me die." And God says, not in so many words, "Elijah, I hear what you are asking for, but instead, out of my compassion and mercy, I'm giving you what you need. Stand in the cleft of the rock on a high place. What you've asked for is your absence from this life. I choose for you to experience instead all of my presence in it. Wait for it, Elijah." What do you think Elijah thought he was waiting for there at the mouth of the cave on the mountain of God? What would we be waiting for? Would we expect God's presence to show up as, I don't know, an earthquake that shakes Brooklyn brownstones and Manhattan delicatessens on a weekday morning? How about the sun suddenly ducking behind a moon shadow and plunging middle America into an eerie, chilly twilight on an early afternoon? Fireworks? Brass band? Ticker tape? What is the Iron Age equivalent of ticker tape anyway? But if Elijah expected God to show up in sound and fury, in hurricane wind, in quaking earth, in raging fire, one by one these showed themselves to be pretenders at revealing God's presence after the searing flame, after the rolling earth and tumbling stone, after the violent breath of the wind, after, there was the sound of not sound, a soft whisper, a gentle blowing, a still small voice, a hissing of the wind as if softly breathing, a light silence, sheer silence. Because maybe, just maybe, when all around us is chaos and noise, hurricane, earthquake, fire, even before that, the sound of our own fear and despairing, God's presence can come to us as the silence that is enough at once to stun and to soothe. However the sound, not sound, presented itself, God was in it. God was in it in a way that Elijah recognized. And in that still life held breath moment, full of God, Elijah found himself reconciling impulses that might reflect the sound, not sound, of God's presence. Elijah surrendered to his impulse to shield himself from the allness of God's being by wrapping his mantle around his face. But friends, he did not let his impulse have the last word. For Elijah gave in to a second impulse on the mountain of God that day. Elijah shielded his face, but he yielded to the impulse to move toward the full silence where he sensed God's presence. He stepped into the silence. And into the silence there came a voice. The question would be familiar to Elijah's ears, to ours. We have heard Elijah offer up his answer once, and then the world changed. The hurricane blew, the earth quaked, tongues of flame danced, and God was in the absolute stillness. This Elijah, the Elijah of the after, had shielded his face and yielded himself to the deep silence of the God who had listened. And now this God would ask again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" If love won't fix things, what are we doing here? If love won't fix things, what are we doing here? Doing here day after day, trying to put out the fires along the way? What are we doing here night after night, knocking ourselves out, trying to get it right?